Multilingualism is actually a major part of life around the world today, and it's quite unremarkable when you think about it. There are an estimated 5,000 to 7,000 languages spoken across roughly 200 sovereign states. That's a huge diversity of languages in just a relatively small number of countries. Now, an interesting fact is that about 2/3 of the world's children grow up in bilingual environments. This means that being bilingual isn't just a rare exception anymore. It's becoming the norm globally. When researchers talk about bilingualism, they often use it as a general term that covers not just two languages, but also quadri, or even quinquelingualism, meaning people or communities that use 3, 4, or 5 languages. So, what does all this tell us? Essentially, multilingualism is widespread, deeply embedded in many societies, and a natural part of human communication today. This sets the stage for understanding how language shapes identity, culture, and even cognitive processes across the globe. As we look at this slide, I want to highlight how ongoing processes like globalization, international migration, and modern electronic communication are really expanding the reach and impact of language contact around the world. These forces are making it more common and more complex for different languages to interact and influence each other. You'll notice that at least half of the world's population is estimated to be bilingual or multilingual. That means many people are routinely using 2 or more languages every day, which is quite remarkable. It's a testament to how interconnected and diverse our societies have become. Now, why is this important? Well, multilingualism gives us a unique window into the universal properties of the human mind. It shows us how flexible and capable our brains are when managing multiple languages. Additionally, it reflects our species' incredible genetic potential for language. So, understanding the prevalence of multilingualism isn't just about languages. It's about understanding human cognition and the extraordinary capabilities we possess. This theme ties into the broader idea that language is a fundamental part of what makes us human, and these global trends help us explore that deeper. Societal multilingualism refers to the situation where a whole community or society uses multiple languages in their daily interactions. It's about how different languages come into contact within the same social space, often leading to the use of several codes during conversations. Now, there's an important distinction to make here between de jure bilingualism, which means that multiple languages have official legal recognition, like being recognized in laws or policies, and de facto bilingualism, which describes how people actually use language in their everyday lives, regardless of what's officially recognized. Many multilingual societies experience what's called diglossia. That's a stable situation where different languages or language varieties are assigned specific social functions. Think of it as a division between a high variety used in formal settings like government or education, and a low variety used in everyday, informal contexts. This separation helps maintain social order and clarity in communication. It's also interesting to note that nation-states are often imagined communities, a term that highlights how national identity is constructed socially and culturally. Even if a country officially recognizes only 1 or 2 languages, the reality is usually much more complex, with many diverse languages spoken by the population. This creates a fascinating contrast between official language policies and the rich linguistic diversity that exists on the ground. So, understanding societal multilingualism is crucial because it shapes how communities function, how identities are formed, and how language policies impact everyday life. It's a key piece of the broader picture of how language and society interact. Let's take a closer look at societal patterns related to multilingualism. One common pattern is territorial bilingualism, where different linguistic groups tend to live in specific regions and have official rights within those areas. For example, in countries like Switzerland, Belgium, or Canada, you'll see this kind of arrangement, which helps maintain linguistic diversity while respecting regional identities. Now, when we think about the long-term effects of societal multilingualism, one key outcome is language shift. This is a gradual process where a community might start using a new, more dominant language over generations, often replacing their ancestral language. It's a natural, yet complex, aspect of language change over time. In communities that are multilingual, the choice of language isn't just about communication. It's a powerful act of identity. The language someone chooses to speak can express their sense of belonging, their social status, or cultural membership. It's a way for speakers to negotiate relationships of power and solidarity within their social environment. All of these points tie back to the bigger picture of societal multilingualism, illustrating how language shapes and reflects social structures, identities, and cultural dynamics. Earlier, researchers had very strict ideas about what it meant to be bilingual. They believed a bilingual person had to have near-native control of two languages, essentially thinking of them as two monolinguals in one person. But nowadays, the definitions are much more inclusive. For example, some say that as soon as someone can produce complete and meaningful sentences in a second language, they are considered bilingual. Modern researchers often define bilingualism more broadly. They might say that a person is bilingual if they have at least minimal competence in one or more of the 4 key language skills: listening, speaking, reading, or writing. It's not about being perfect in everything, but having some functional ability. Others focus more on how people actually use languages in daily life. If someone regularly uses 2 or more languages or dialects, regardless of how proficient they are, they can be considered bilingual. So the key takeaway here is that bilingualism isn't a strict, all-or-nothing concept. It's a spectrum, and definitions vary depending on context and purpose. This helps us understand the diversity of bilingual experiences and how they relate to the overall theme of language and communication. Let's take a closer look at what bilinguality really means. It refers to the internal psychological state of an individual who has access to more than one linguistic code for social communication. In other words, it's about how a person internally manages and switches between languages. Now, societal bilingualism is a bit different. It describes the situation within a community or society where 2 or more languages are in contact. This often results in people using 2 different codes in the same interaction, depending on the context. It's interesting to note that a country can be officially bilingual through laws and regulations, yet most of its citizens might be monolingual in everyday life. Conversely, a country might be officially monolingual, but still host diverse multilingual populations. This distinction between individual bilinguality and societal bilingualism is really useful for researchers. It helps them separate what's happening inside a person's mind from the external political or social structures that influence language use. So, when we talk about bilinguality versus bilingualism, we're essentially looking at the internal versus external aspects of language. Understanding this helps us see the bigger picture of how languages coexist and influence society and individual identities. Balanced bilinguality describes a situation where a person has reached a similar level of skill in both languages. However, it's important to note that this balance is rarely perfectly equal across all language functions. Most people are actually either non-fluent or just beginning to develop bilingual skills, which makes balanced bilinguals quite rare. On the other hand, dominant bilinguality happens when someone is much more proficient in one language, often their mother tongue, compared to the other. This means they might prefer or find it easier to use one language over the other. Then we have receptive or passive bilinguals, who can understand a language, whether spoken or written, but can't produce it themselves. They might understand conversations or read texts in that language, but they don't speak or write in it fluently. So, when we compare balanced versus dominant proficiency, we're really looking at the degree of skill and comfort someone has with each language. Understanding these differences is key to grasping the complexities of bilingual development and how individuals navigate their linguistic environments. Let's talk about compound bilinguality first. This is a state where 2 sets of linguistic signs, think words, symbols, or signs, are linked to the same single set of meanings in the mind. So, when a bilingual person learns two languages in a common context, their brain often associates different words in each language with the same concept or idea. This creates a kind of integrated system where the meanings overlap quite a bit. Now contrast that with coordinate bilinguality. Here, the system is a bit different. Each language has its own separate set of representations and translation equivalents. Words that mean the same thing in both languages correspond to these different sets. So, in this case, the person might see the concepts as linked through translation, but the underlying mental representations are distinct. An important point to remember is that many bilingual individuals don't fit neatly into just one of these categories. Instead, they can be more compound for certain concepts and more coordinate for others. It's a continuum, which means these systems are flexible and can vary depending on the context and the concept in question. This variability in cognitive organization reflects how complex bilingual mental processes are. It also highlights the importance of understanding these distinctions when studying bilingual language development and processing within the broader theme of cognitive organization. Additive bilinguality occurs when the child's environment highly values both languages, creating an enriching experience that stimulates their cognitive development. When both languages and cultures are seen as positive and beneficial, they complement each other, enhancing the child's overall growth without threatening their mother tongue. This approach fosters confidence and a strong cultural identity. On the other hand, subtractive bilinguality happens when the environment devalues the mother tongue, leading to its gradual replacement by a more dominant or prestigious language. This can have negative consequences, such as delaying cognitive development, because the child's first language is essentially being pushed aside. Understanding these environments, additive and subtractive, is crucial because they directly impact how children develop language skills and cultural awareness, which ties back to our broader discussion on supporting bilingual development effectively. Simultaneous acquisition refers to the process where a child is exposed to more than one language right from the start of their speech development or at a very young age. This often happens in families where each parent speaks a different language, following what we call the one-person, one-language principle. It's a common scenario in bilingual households. What's really interesting is that research shows these young bilinguals are quite adept at differentiating their two languages early on. They don't get confused or mix up their languages as many might assume. Instead, they can tell which language to use depending on the context. For example, bilingual infants can choose the appropriate language based on who they are talking to, and this ability can be seen as early as age 2. This highlights how capable they are of managing two linguistic systems simultaneously. Overall, this process of simultaneous acquisition is a natural and effective way for children to become bilingual, and it ties into the broader theme of how young minds are so adaptable when it comes to language learning. Successive or consecutive bilinguality happens when someone learns a second language after they've already acquired their mother tongue. This is quite common, and often how people become bilingual later in life. The critical period hypothesis is a key idea here. It suggests that there's an optimal age range for language learning, usually ending around puberty. This is because our brains become less plastic as we age, making it harder to achieve native-like fluency if we start later. Interestingly, mature learners tend to make quicker initial progress with aspects like word formation and sentence structure, compared to pronunciation, which often takes more time to perfect. On the other hand, if someone starts learning a second language early, before the age of 6 or 7, they're much more likely to develop native-like competence. This highlights the importance of early exposure for achieving the highest proficiency. So, understanding these stages and factors helps us see why timing can be so crucial in language acquisition and why early bilingual education can make such a difference. Most bilinguals, like monolinguals, process language using specialized centers in the brain's left hemisphere. This means that despite knowing two languages, our brains tend to handle both through similar regions. Functional neuroimaging studies have shown that the patterns of brain activation are quite consistent across different speakers, which is fascinating because it suggests a shared neural basis for language processing. However, there are some differences depending on whether someone is an early or late bilingual. Late bilinguals often represent their second language in distinct spatial sites within Broca's area, whereas early bilinguals tend to have a lot of overlap in these regions, indicating more integrated processing. Also, when someone is using a less proficient language, their brain needs to work harder. It activates more extensive areas to exert control and inhibit the non-target language, which shows how the brain manages multiple languages dynamically. All of this ties into the broader theme of how complex and adaptable our neural systems are when it comes to bilingualism. Bilingual aphasics often show interesting and complex recovery patterns after brain damage. Sometimes, one language recovers faster or more completely than the other, and this varies from person to person. Ribot's law offers one explanation for these differences. It predicts that the oldest, first-learned language tends to be more resistant to damage and should recover first. So, if someone learned a second language later in life, their first language might bounce back more quickly after a stroke or injury. On the other hand, Pitter's law suggests that the language most familiar or frequently used at the time of the brain injury is likely to recover first. This means that the language a person is actively using when they experience the brain damage might come back sooner, regardless of age of acquisition. It's also important to recognize that recovery isn't always straightforward. Some patients experience parallel recovery, where both languages come back at the same time, while others experience antagonistic recovery. In these cases, one language might regress or become less accessible as the other improves. Understanding these different patterns helps us grasp the complexity of bilingual aphasia and underscores the importance of personalized treatment approaches. It really highlights how language recovery is influenced by both the history of language learning and current use. Let's dive into how the mental lexicon works. It contains language-specific entries called lemmas, which store important morphological and syntactic information tagged for each particular language. These lemmas help us organize and access words efficiently. Psycholinguistic experiments show that, even when we're speaking only one language, both of our languages are actually activated in parallel. This means our brain is simultaneously processing both languages, which is quite fascinating. Now, when it comes to cognates, words that look and mean the same in both languages, they tend to be recognized faster. This is because of this parallel activation, which speeds up the recognition process for similar words. Moving on to the revised hierarchical model, it suggests that for second language learners, L2 words are initially linked to concepts through their L1 translations. So, at first, we think of the translation in our first language to get to the meaning. But as proficiency increases, these direct links between L2 words and concepts become stronger, making access more direct. All of this ties into the overall theme of how our mental lexicon and language processing are interconnected, especially in bilinguals, highlighting the complexity and efficiency of our language system. Let's explore how bilinguals operate along a language mode continuum. At one end, we have a totally monolingual mode, where only one language is highly active, and the other is essentially deactivated or inhibited to prevent interference. This is often the case when someone is focused on a specific language environment. On the other end, we have a fully bilingual mode, where both languages are active simultaneously, which allows for mixed language behaviors like code switching and borrowing. The key thing to remember is that the specific mode a person is in isn't fixed. It depends heavily on contextual factors. For example, who you're talking to, what you're discussing, and the overall purpose of the interaction all influence whether you're closer to a monolingual or bilingual mode. This continuum really highlights the flexibility and adaptability of bilingual language use. It's not just about switching back and forth, but existing somewhere along this spectrum, depending on the situation. Understanding this helps us appreciate the dynamic nature of bilingual communication and how context shapes language activation. Let's talk about diglossia. It's a stable societal situation where two languages or varieties coexist, each reserved for different social functions. The key idea here is that these varieties don't overlap in their use, they're distinct. The high, or H, variety is usually employed in formal public settings. Think about government, media, or education, places where prestige and formality matter most. This is the variety you use when addressing an audience or engaging in official matters. On the other hand, the low, or L, variety is more informal. It's what people use in everyday conversations, within families, or among friends. It's about solidarity and closeness. Think of casual chats or private interactions. In classic diglossia, these varieties are often related dialects, similar enough to be understood, but used in different contexts. But there's also something called extended diglossia, where the two varieties are actually different languages that aren't structurally related. Understanding diglossia helps us see how societies structure language use according to social function, which ties into the broader theme of how language shapes social identity and interaction. Let's talk about code switching, which is basically when someone switches between two or more languages within the same conversation, utterance, or sentence. It's a common phenomenon among bilingual speakers and reflects their ability to navigate both languages seamlessly. There are two main types to keep in mind. First, we have intersentential code switching, which happens at the boundary between sentences or clauses. So you might finish a sentence in one language and then start the next in another. It's like a switch that occurs at a sentence level. Then there's intersentential code switching, which is more integrated. This involves mixing different linguistic units, like words, phrases, or even parts of sentences, within a single sentence. It's a more fluid and complex form of switching that requires a lot of skill. Proficient code switching, however, isn't random. It's actually rule-governed and reflects high bilingual competence. It shows that the speaker has a strong command of both grammatical systems and can switch appropriately depending on context, topic, or conversational needs. Understanding these patterns helps us see how bilinguals communicate naturally and adaptively, which ties directly into the overall theme of language flexibility and cultural identity. The matrix language frame model suggests that in bilingual speech, one language acts as the backbone, providing the morphosyntactic structure, while the other contributes the content words. Essentially, the matrix language, or ML, sets the surface order of morphemes and supplies the functional system morphemes, like tense and agreement markers. Meanwhile, the content morphemes, things like noun and verb stems, can come from either the matrix language or the embedded language, or EL. This flexibility allows for a mix of vocabulary from both languages, but within a structured framework. Another key point is the idea of linear constraints, such as the equivalence constraint. These constraints suggest that language switches tend to happen where the surface structures of both languages align or map onto each other. This helps maintain grammatical coherence even when switching between languages. All of this ties into the broader concept of grammatical models of code switching, which aim to explain how and why bilingual speakers alternate languages in a grammatically structured way. Understanding these models helps us see that code switching isn't random. It's governed by underlying grammatical principles that keep communication clear and fluent. Let's talk about the communication accommodation theory. Essentially, it suggests that when we communicate, we often modify our speech to either converge toward or diverge from our interlocutors. Converging means we adjust our language to become more similar, which helps decrease social distance and can actually help us gain social approval from the person we're speaking with. On the other hand, divergence involves increasing social distance, which can serve to emphasize group identity or to set ourselves apart from others. Now, tying this to the bigger picture, these strategies are all about how we manage our social relationships through language. Moving to the markedness model, this theory suggests that our choice of language codes, like dialects, accents, or formal versus informal speech, is a kind of negotiation. We're constantly weighing the expected rights and obligations in an interaction to decide what's most appropriate. And that brings us to social motivations for language choice. Basically, our decisions about how we speak are driven by our desire to connect, distinguish ourselves, or navigate social expectations. These models help us understand the deeper reasons behind why we adapt or stick to certain ways of speaking in different contexts. Let's talk about language maintenance first. This occurs when a community continues to use its first language across generations, even when they come into contact with a dominant second language. It's a way of preserving cultural identity and heritage through language. On the other hand, language shift happens when a community gradually replaces their original language with a new one, often leading to the eventual death of the original language. This process can be quite rapid or slow, but it ultimately results in the loss of linguistic diversity. To understand whether a language will survive or fade away, we look at something called ethnolinguistic vitality. This concept evaluates a group's demographic strength, their social status, and the institutional support they receive. All these factors help us predict the likelihood of a language's survival in the long run. Another important factor is the strength of social networks within the community. Close-knit social ties and strong in-group connections are crucial because they help resist language shift. These networks provide a support system that encourages continued use of the minority language and helps maintain cultural traditions. So, in summary, language maintenance involves actively keeping a language alive across generations, while language shift is the process of losing that language over time. The vitality of a language depends on demographic, social, and institutional factors, and tight community bonds play a vital role in preserving linguistic heritage. This all ties back to our broader theme of understanding how languages persist or fade in a changing world. Immersion education teaches the majority language students through the medium of a second language, which helps them develop functional proficiency and biliteracy. This approach encourages students to become fluent not just in the language they are immersed in, but also to maintain their home language skills. Transitional programs, on the other hand, use the student's mother tongue initially. The idea here is to use their native language as a foundation, easing their transition into the dominant societal language over time. This helps build confidence and understanding as they adapt to new linguistic environments. Two-way programs are particularly interesting because they bring together speakers of both languages. The goal is to promote bilingualism for all students by splitting their time between the two languages, fostering mutual understanding and language skills for everyone involved. Finally, bilingual education tends to be most effective when both languages are highly valued within the school community. When both languages are recognized for their communicative and cognitive functions, students are more motivated and able to develop true bilingual proficiency. All these models highlight the importance of strategic language use in education, reinforcing that valuing both languages and cultures is key to successful bilingual learning.